Hi everybody!
PlayStation needs resistance now more than ever. But why is that? We're going to explore that in this video. So strap in, smash the subscribe button, while we reminisce about a retro PlayStation title that needs to return. Here are 7 reasons why Resistance needs to come back. While shooters are the most popular type of game, we're definitely past the point where they were the primary reason you bought a system. But that's not to say they aren't still extremely important to the backbone of a console, since they offer things you just can't get with other styles of games. At present, PlayStation doesn't exactly have what I'd call a premier first-person shooter franchise to call its own. This is one of the largest gaps in its library, since you have a pretty decent third-person shooter in Helldivers 2. Ratchet and Clank holds down the fort with its third-person shooter and platformer hybrid gameplay. Then you have straight action games like the Horizon series or God of War, among others. This generation of PlayStation exclusives is the most diverse it has been since the PS3 days, but they still have a few holes, which is something I'll be discussing in a separate video. But as you can see, there isn't a first-person shooter in the core lineup. It's almost like Sony was giving Microsoft the win on that one. However, it's telling just how toxic it was to the health of Xbox for them to put their eggs all in the shooter basket, like they did since the very first Xbox. It's now to a point they can no longer stay afloat without putting their exclusives on other platforms beyond PC. Case in point, PlayStation now has access to both Gears of War and Halo, and this won't be changing going forward. We're going to get more and more of these titles, but the remakes for Gears of War and Halo are the very reasons PlayStation really does need to bring Resistance back. Earlier in the year, I released a video discussing a theory I had based off the fact we only had access to all of the Resistance games via PlayStation Plus for a few months, before the games got delisted with a few exceptions. Couple that with Insomniac Games, the creator of Resistance, hiring people for a multiplayer project back in 2023, and I'd say things do point to Resistance returning in some capacity. Which would be kind of a power play on PlayStation's part when you think about it. Given it now has access to Halo, they could kind of one-up Xbox on this one. Hopefully it won't be as woeful a power play as the Toronto Maple Leafs have been during the early goings of the 2025-26 season. At present, it sits 28th in the league at 13%, with league average around 20. That's telling. Just as telling as Microsoft throwing in the towel on the console war. But PlayStation bringing back one of its Halo killers would actually benefit PlayStation massively. So let's explore that a little bit. Back in the day, having the Halo killer label attached to a PlayStation exclusive shooter was a bigger hindrance than it was a benefit, because it wasn't going to convince an Xbox fanboy to jump ship and become a so-called Sony pony. In fact, it just further served to divide the gaming community, as way too many individuals with nothing going for them made the success of their given gaming machine their whole personalities. Which is never a good thing, since it's always a good idea for people to have more going on for them than just sitting at home eating shitty food and being too lazy to get a real job. So why is it that Resistance would no longer be hindered by the Halo Killer label? It's because Halo is no longer seen as the premier FPS franchise out there. It's kind of like how Final Fantasy lost its luster a long time ago and is no longer the pinnacle of JRPGs. The fall of Halo also kind of mirrors the fall of Final Fantasy II. Think about it. Both series became the biggest names in their respective genres, and were on the top so long developers got complacent and started coasting. For Final Fantasy, this started to occur around the time of Final Fantasy XII, after 4 straight bangers and a well-received MMORPG. Halo, on the other hand, fell off far faster. I would say it started losing its luster by the 3rd entry, as that seems to be where a lot of people first started falling off the franchise. Given Halo isn't viewed in the same light it used to be, this means a new, or in this case, old FPS is positioned to seize the crown. If we really look at it, PlayStation have 2 IPs they could use to take that mantle of best shooter on consoles. It could either be Killzone or Resistance. I think we can pretty much rule out Killzone, since they haven't done anything with that IP since the launch of the PlayStation 4, and Guerrilla Games seems far more interested in milking Horizon for all it's worth. leaving Resistance the only option, since realistically, it's very doubtful PlayStation will want to take the risk on a brand new IP to become their premier FPS title. Better the devil you know, and all that. Also, given Halo is now on PlayStation, they don't really have the same incentive to kill it, as doing so would just shoot them in the foot. But having Resistance and Halo on the same system is really just going to benefit PlayStation in the long run. Okay, this one is going to seem like a really odd thought, but hear me out. Generally speaking, PlayStation doesn't exactly have a multiplayer experience you'd consider top of the class, at least not when it comes to exclusives. Marvel Tokon, which comes out next year, is going to alleviate that issue just a bit. However, fighting games don't have quite the same mass appeal that shooters do. This is mostly because shooters have a much smaller barrier of entry because it takes less time to understand and utilize the fundamentals, whereas a fighting game, especially a tag fighter, yeah, that's going to take more hours to even understand a lot of the basics, meaning the player base gets filtered out far faster. Also, you have to consider the niche PlayStation has carved out for itself over the last 2 decades, more or less. They dabbled in the multiplayer space over that time period, but it never caught on quite the same way it did for the Xbox family of consoles. This is partially because the PlayStation experience for multiplayer just wasn't as robust. So, of course, the people who were more into the competitive side of gaming were either going to plonk themselves on a PC or they were going to go for an Xbox. So, PlayStation decided to niche down to primarily single player, narrative driven experiences, which did insanely well for them. However, as I've said in many videos, the cracks in that foundation are starting to show. A lot, actually. Just look at how expensive the average cinematic game Sony produce costs. It's astronomically high, which means these games have to sell insanely well just to break even, and pretty much be record breaking if they hope to turn a decent profit margin. That isn't sustainable, and it never was going to be. Thankfully, Sony did realize that during Jim Ryan's tenure, but I'm working on a different video essay that will go into more detail on that. But Cliff's Note version, it didn't go well for Sony in this case, as they had constant failure after failure on the live service market, with Helldivers 2 more or less being the only diamond in the rough. However, that game is a PvE experience, and it's not a PvP one, meaning PlayStation still lacks a killer multiplayer experience. It's one Resistance can easily fill, since the original trilogy had really fun multiplayer matches. So again, it's filling a niche. When you think about it though, Resistance is probably PlayStation's best IP to straddle the line between a cinematic experience and a game as a service title. Now, I'm generally against live service games, since the vast majority of them are shoddily made titles looking to just cash in on a trend. But you have to realize, games as a service is here to stay, and companies will keep pushing them out because they just need one or two smash hits to really churn profit. First-person shooters, by their very nature, lend themselves well to the concept. So Resistance is actually the best IP PlayStation's got when it comes to making a live service game. Plus, things could be a bit of a hybrid affair like they were during the PS3 days. Hear me out. You ship the game with a robust campaign along with a secondary campaign for players that want to have a PvE experience. You also ship the game with your standard shooter gameplay modes, so not only have you made profit off the sale of the initial game, but you can further nickel and dime the player with the multiplayer modes. Is it scummy? Yeah, it is. But there are ways to make it less predatory towards the player base. Have it so you're unlocking some basic skins and other cosmetics through normal gameplay, just like how it was back in the day. Then introduce a battle pass, which players pay for, giving them access to more premium skins and the like. But pitch it as being intended to upgrade the game and maintain the servers. It's exactly how Bandai Namco does things with the battle pass and DLC characters in Tekken 8. But why is Resistance the perfect candidate for this model of gaming? It's because the campaign for the games, while not the greatest stories, fits with the cinematic ethos PlayStation have been cultivating for the past 20-odd years. Plus, like I just illustrated, it already has the elements for being a live service title baked into it. This gives PlayStation the best of both worlds, Plus, they could always offer the multiplayer as a free-to-play deal for the people who only want to engage with the multiplayer aspects. It's literally a no-lose situation for both PlayStation and the player. Seriously, PlayStation should hire me as a consultant. This next one is a point I touched on in my video discussing the Halo remake. Arcade cover-based shooters are due for a resurgence in the very near future, and PlayStation could be ahead of the curve if they start a remake for the Resistance series soon. Games take 3 to 5 years on average to make, from pre-production to going gold. Now, let's just say that multiplayer project Insomniac Games was hiring for back in 2023 entered full development then. That means next year will be the official 3-year mark, meaning the game could be ready for the fall or winter window of 2026. That's if development went smoothly without any major hiccups. However, most games do encounter major hiccups at some stage during their development, which means a release in either 2027 or 28 is the likelier release window, which could have us in the next generation window if leaks and rumors are to be believed, which, depending on how you look at things, is either the best or worst time to release a game. Usually, this is when developers release the very best the system has to offer, because they finally understand how to work with the hardware effectively. However, it can also be the worst time to release a game, since people will more than likely be saving money towards the next-gen upgrade. For developers and publishers, this can lead to games vastly underperforming expectations, which is similar to what happened with Resistance 3. While it didn't have to contend with next-generation systems over the horizon, it did get cannibalized by its cousin in Uncharted 3, leading to the sales being thoroughly mediocre, and PlayStation losing faith in the brand, which had propped up the system during the early days of that generation. But if you consider the cycle of what's old is new again, you really start to see why Resistance would work in this day and age, especially if Sony's progressive on it. While a lot of gamers feel the PS5 is close to tapped out in terms of power, that's a lot harder to quantify than people think. Also, when you consider just how old the system is at this point, that's pretty impressive. But I think there's a lot of untapped potential to be had. And generally speaking, first-person shooters tend to push what a system's capabilities actually are. And we really haven't had an opportunity to see that in action with the PS5, not from a first-party studio at least. We've had plenty of third-party FPS titles that do push the hardware a little, but let's face it, third-party developers rarely, if ever, have the capabilities of tapping into a console's true potential, meaning Insomniac or whoever happens to take up this potential project could really push what the PS5 can do. Just look at how hard Insomniac have managed to push the PS5 with their releases over this generation. Spider-Man Remastered, which I've done a review for, didn't really push the boundaries all that much. It was very much a getting their feet wet kind of game, especially when you consider it was packed in with a certain version of Miles Morales, which I am working on a review of. But Miles really didn't push what the system was capable of. Did it look pretty when it released? Yeah. Does it still look pretty? Also yes. But we truly started seeing the PS5's potential when Ratchet Clank Rift Apart released a few months later, since that game was actually built with the PS5 in mind, and wasn't a cross-generational release. Spider-Man 2 definitely pushed what the hardware could do, and was a technical marvel, as it should be considering its budget. Now we know Wolverine's coming next year, and Insomniac have covered in great depth just how much work went into the physics engine for the blood splatter alone. Just think what they could do with Resistance, a game that would have to push the limits of either PS5 or be a very early showcase of what the PSX is capable of. This next point is really deep in the weeds and might seem a bit out of left field, but consider this. The PlayStation 3 came out in 2006, so next year, that system is going to be 20 years old. At present, the PS5 is 5 years old. Usually, consoles start the sunsetting process after 7 years, meaning we're potentially in the PS6 release window in the very near future. Also, think about this. Developers love to celebrate major milestones for games once they reach a certain age, either by releasing a totally new entry in the series or by remaking an older one. Do I think Insomniac will shadow drop a remake for Resistance next year? Of course not, because realistically, they won't. It'd take away from the fanfare surrounding Wolverine, which is going to be a big deal for the company. Now we know it's slated for a late release next year. When's late enough in the year Insomniac could potentially show off whatever they're working on next? Sometime in September to October, when PlayStation typically holds either a showcase if they have a lot to show, or a state of play if they just have 1 to 3 things to announce. So maybe we hear something about it during that time frame, but I honestly doubt it. I know I'm babbling, but I'm building to something here. This leads me to believe we could potentially see Resistance return to consoles on the PlayStation 6. It'd almost be poetic, really. It was birthed during the PS3 era, dormant all through the PS4 era, and had a brief glimpse of something during the present day. I'm of the opinion Sony were testing the waters for a potential Resistance return when they put out the first 2 games on PS Plus along with Retribution and Burning Skies. The fact they got removed less than a year later tells me PlayStation have plans to do something with the IP in the very near future, maybe a straight up remastered collection. But my gut is telling me we're going to see a ground up remake for Resistance Fall of Man when the PlayStation 6 comes out. Again, because it'd almost be poetic, especially when you consider the remake for Demon's Souls was a PS5 launch title, and was a major selling point for many. The original Demon's Souls was a 2009 PS3 title that failed to capture an audience initially, but gained a following over time and helped spawn a new subgenre of games, that being Souls-likes. Clearly, Resistance won't spawn a new type of game, given it's from a genre with clearly defined rules and expectations. But again, there's a bit of poetic justice here. And if it happens, it'd be a weird but interesting pattern. So there are my 7 reasons why Resistance needs to make a triumphant return. Think I missed out on any reasons? Let me know in the comments. And if you want to check out more of my Resistance or Insomniac videos, why not check out one appearing on screen in a few seconds? But until next time, keep blazing that trail.